Welcome back to the Becoming Noble podcast. Today I have with me my friend Evan Amato. Evan is a scholar of Italian history. He can introduce himself more fully, but he reached out to me. We've been in correspondence for some time and suggested that the Medici might be an excellent historical illustration of some of the themes that I've been discussing with my work on inheritance, nepotism, the formation of wealthy children, and so forth. I thought that was a fantastic idea, and I'm very excited to welcome him on. He's a fantastic scholar in the public domain. He's got a Substack. He has a very popular Twitter account and so forth. So, Evan, welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself more fully.
Johann, thanks for having me. Look, I think probably the best introduction to give for this sort of thing is just to say that I am someone who is actively living out a lot of the stuff that you're writing. And so every time I get a new email from you, it's applicable. I get to run to my wife and say, look at this. This is everything I've been thinking about over the past couple of weeks, but it's now fully fledged, laid out precisely in this article. So part of, practical example of this is I live in Italy. And obviously, thinking about how I want to leave a legacy and leave stuff to my children after me, what does that look like? And my wife is Italian, and she's very much, by merit of her being Italian, she's very much already on board with everything you'd have to write about nepotism, for example. What is the point of starting a business if not to pass it down to your children? And so these are a lot of things that, I'm dealing with not just personally, but also as someone who enjoys history and gets to look back at the lives of great individuals and great families. This is something that gets picked up all the time, whether you're talking about, a dynasty as majestic as the Habsburgs, or even unknown families relatively like the Rezzonico in northern Italy, obviously the Medici, but just to see how these same patterns keep on playing out time after time again. And so I'm just at a fun point where I'm able to enjoy your writing fully and feel like, based on what I'm studying and writing about week after week and what I'm actually trying to live and build business wise, it all intersects.
Could you introduce the Medici and give an indication as to why they might be relevant for this discussion?
So the Medici are a family that, to say they ruled over Italy is definitely an exaggeration, but they were absolutely, without a doubt, the godfathers of the Renaissance. So to give you an idea of this, basically any artist that you've heard of, any popular Italian artist that you've heard of, chances are they've not only grown up tangentially entwined in Medici circles, but odds are good that they actually dined at the table, okay, with them. So a great example of this is Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He had in his house, living with him, dining with him, the likes of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Botticelli. And so Da Vinci and Botticelli, for example, these are guys who grew up literally breaking bread together, getting in arguments with each other, having conversations over the table. But it's not just art that the reason the Medici are important. So the Medici obviously go into the finance of art and the beautification of their city for a couple reasons. One is that it's a way of establishing their power, to look at it cynically. So this is a banking family that has grown up, and they have understood that Florentine politics, because they come from the Republic of Florence, which is a republic in many ways in name only, but they understand that while politics and whatnot change daily in Florence, what does not change is the impression that you leave to the people. So they build these beautiful buildings. They embellish doors, facades, windows, everything that you can think of, so that when the average citizenry is walking around Florence, they can't help but feel the Medici influence, even when they're exiled, and they will be exiled at many points in their history. But the other reason they're really applicable is not only because of how they build this dynasty and have this run for many years, but for how they legitimize their power and then how they also retain and entrench it. So a couple notes on this, these are people who come essentially from nothing, and they go in and they, build up to where they eventually marry off into the French royalty. Even, they become proper dukes, they become proper nobles in Italy, but also in Europe abroad. But in doing so, they're also having to run the politics. And as opposed to many other noble families who do it overtly, if you're a king, it's obvious that you are the one in charge. They are operating in what is by name a republic, but they're operating, all the strings of power are unseen, and they try to keep it that way. Only a couple times do they go out and they're kind of like overtly, quote unquote, ruling Florence. But the other times they're operating things behind the scenes. And so I think that, forget the other reasons why they're interesting, but that by itself is interesting enough because it's far more relevant to the ways in which power is held today and the ways in which people hold and retain power today. And the Medici knew that, this is one way that we have to do this. We have to make it completely unseen.
The politics and the intertwining of art and faith and power are so complex and difficult to disentangle. It's sort of very counterintuitive because faith is an act of selfless devotion to God. Power is obviously the attempt to dominate others. And neatly delineating those in the story of the Medici is very, very complex. With Giovanni's initial foray into artistic patronage, with his involvement in the commissioning of the Brunelleschi rebuilding of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents, the orphanage which a lot of the young but very poor Florentians pass through, the so-called popolo minuto, the literal small people who were diminutive in stature precisely because they were starved in their poverty. On the one hand, it's this incredible building. I'd encourage people to look it up. It features these incredible slender columns, which were the first time that columns were used as a true architectural support, as opposed to a sort of artistic flourish since the Roman Empire. It's this gorgeous building. On the other hand, it's not an act of selflessness. It's a sort of act of declaration that he is a man who represents and seeks patronage from a very specific part of the Florentian populace, which puts him at odds with the other nobles, the other aristocrats of the city. The distinction between authentic faith and growing humanism in the Renaissance is itself very complex. You have many of the artists like Donatello, for example, who produces the statue of David, which resides in the Medici Manor. On the one hand, it's this wonderful and innovative expression of artistic innovation after a period of long formalism in the history of statuary. And the subject is David, who's a biblical figure. On the other, you look at it and you can't help but recognize that this is essentially a sort of homoerotic artwork. The man has a sort of feminized body. He has long flowing hair. He has this extravagant hat. So all of these themes are so difficult to disentangle. It's a very subtle period of history, but the Medici make for absolutely fascinating study in this regard.
Absolutely. And you hit on part of the paradox of all this, a paradox which has unfortunately been made even more difficult to discern and actually get at the truth of because of horrendous 20th century scholarship. So one guy who writes well on the Medici, and he has a good biography of them, Paul Strathern. He is also a man who basically will never miss an opportunity to insert, oh yeah, he was gay. With basically, the smallest of quote unquote evidence, anything that could be used. And this is what, all contemporary scholars of the Renaissance, I use that word lightly, scholars of the Renaissance do, is they try to turn anyone and everyone gay. And it's a shame because, there are times where what you said, the statue of David, yeah, there's something that's overtly, homoerotic about it. But at the same time, the real degree to which this is happening is far less than what people will tell you. And so it's so hard to get at. But of course, yes, there are, to zoom out, there are many conflicting and at times seemingly opposed kind of tendencies going on here and motivations. But part of the beauty of the Medici, as a family who can really highlight this so well, is that they show that there are ways still to apply all these things and to apply these paradoxes. And so, we had mentioned before, I realized after I said it, the Medici are on one hand making power visible through their art, through what they build, what they construct in the city, and what everyone's looking at. On the other hand, they make it invisible, and that the real levers of power are completely unseen by the populace, and that they follow the outward expressions of the Republic of Florence. but you have this paradox. So on one hand, that power is immensely visible and also completely invisible. And you have this same paradox show up with a lot of other things. The genuine nature of the faith that's driving these works. That's something that comes into conflict at times. But I think to bring it back to us and what this has to show with what we're doing, you know, these things are messy to say the least, and they require deft navigation to figure out how to live them out well and properly. I think it's we caught up in the trap of thinking that to live a certain way, it's just going to be clear and easy, and your integrity is going to be obvious, at every step of the road. But there's going to be real trade-offs and real considerations, things that you have to, keep in mind. And so to know that in advance is what this is all coming down to. I'm not saying just, oh, accept that there are trade-offs and lose your integrity. It's saying that accept that there are going to be these predicaments where things like faith and power come into conflict, and you're going to have to know, what to do and what not to do in those situations.
This is one of the things that clearly informs the work of Machiavelli in the subsequent period, which is that to refuse to engage with the subtleties here, and almost as an expression of pride, to put your piety and your integrity on full display and to insist on those to the expense of good governance, political realism, is actually a very questionable act, because it can lead to such instability if you're not willing to engage in this subtle realpolitik, political administration of the kind you describe, where actually some things are being done quietly in the shadows. There's maneuvering, there are power plays, there is the, I hesitate to say weaponization, but certainly the operationalization of artwork in the service of political goals.
Yeah, Machiavelli is someone who's really interesting with this. I've likened him in the past to a palantir from Lord of the Rings, which, for anyone who doesn't know, the palantir is basically something that you can look into, and it shows you glimpses of the future. And what it shows you is true, but it's a selective viewing. So it's only a select image. And if you only look into that and you only see that, what you'll see will lead you to despair. But to zoom out and actually understand that that is, a select image, basically, if you only read Machiavelli, this is the point of it, then what he says is true. But if you accept him as the finality on that, then you'll be led into despair. It's hopeless. What he says is true, but there are other things, namely the realm of faith in particular, that can be brought in to attenuate what he says. And so this is really important. And it goes back to another thing, just to touch on the Medici once more, that they understand. There's this whole, and this doesn't need to be a history of the Medici, but there's this whole period of what they're doing where they are going out and literally sending, manuscript hunters out all over the world. They're sending them to all the different monasteries in Italy and elsewhere. They're sending them to Byzantium. They're sending them abroad to go and collect knowledge, because they understand, yes, money is power and power is power, but also, and unironically, knowledge is power. And that's why they are so focused on, developing the arts, developing schools, universities, scriptoriums, because they realize that knowledge is power too. And this is what you see in, again, the Renaissance, the rebirth. They're having these conversations. They're having literal, Socratic societies that get together and discuss these ideals. Michelangelo grew up attending them, for example. And so they're wrestling with these things and trying to understand the intersection of all of it. And I think that's just part of what makes them so interesting.
As you say, you have to be cautious with overemphasizing the stark realism of Machiavelli, because everything becomes a conversation about power, when in fact there is genuine piety and passion involved. I think a good example actually is precisely what you mentioned, which is Cosimo de' Medici's patronage of scholarship. So sending out into monasteries in particular, and indeed saving many manuscripts from Constantinople, which at the time was in the process of falling. That was as much an expression of the passion of a kind of gentleman scholar and an eccentric as it was a sort of any kind of raw power play. And the same is true in his patronage of the arts. One thing that made his legacy possible was the fact that he had genuine taste, and that can only really be born of passion. It was innovative, it was forward thinking, it was open minded. It wasn't just a calculated, shrewd business decision. This is a man who was raised in a high cultural setting and whose artistic vision, whose sensibilities were brought into full fruition. And I think this is a sort of fantastic defense of not giving your children a purely technocratic education, one that is maximally oriented to have them succeed in the future economy. Although clearly elements of that are necessary if they're going to inherit a family business, but to use your opportunity as a person of wealth to give your children, to inhabit that space you've created for them with your wealth, with the insurance that that brings, the potentiality of one expression of the noblesse oblige of the elites, which is to take up the artistic and patronage stewardship of a people to bring their culture into its fullest expression.
The point about Cosimo is really perfect because this is where you get into again everything that you just nailed on the head. So the difference between he and his father Giovanni de' Medici is essentially one of the first. He's kind of the first guy who puts the Medici on the map. But it is his son Cosimo who will be known as Pater Patriae, as father of the nation of Florence. He is the Solomon to the King David. If Giovanni is the King David who comes into the power, but then Solomon's the one who makes it glorious, that is the same thing with Giovanni and Cosimo. But to your point about the education, because this is so key, the generation gap between them was substantial. And Giovanni was someone who knew that he was giving his son, Cosimo, an education that he himself had never had, and in many ways could never understand, because this is when the new rekindling of humanism is coming about. And so Cosimo is interacting with stuff that his father is incapable of really grasping at. But what's interesting is that the two men are acutely aware of this. There's no sense of arrogance on Cosimo's part, and there's no sense of inferiority or trying to believe that he's equal on Giovanni's part. Cosimo he knows what real taste is, as you said, because he's grown up in that culture, and he's able to concretely say, this looks good, this is beautiful, and for these reasons. He's able to grasp at that. But his father is really unable to. And it's played out in the fact that the only time that Giovanni is on record as doing something kind of specifically for the arts is at the very end of his life, when he is on the committee that chooses who is going to make the baptistry doors of the Florentine baptistry right in front of their grand cathedral. And so he's on that commission, but that's basically all he does. And that's at the very end of his life. But he knew that he was giving his son Cosimo something that he didn't have. And in addition to that education, which is, a humanistic education in many ways, he also grew him up in the trade. And so in terms of what, we can learn and take away from that, Giovanni is a fascinating man to look at, because he is in many ways the founder, the unsung founder of this dynasty. Most people start their history of the Medici with Cosimo, but in fact, it's his father who understands that he is building something and building something great, and that it's his responsibility to pass it on to his son, and for his son to far exceed him. And so he keys him up. He doesn't hold it back and say, no, forget that new stuff that they're doing. Like, we're better than that. We're just going to stick to the bread and butter of the business. No. He says, son, go embrace those things. Go learn what you need to go. Go exceed me in those areas, but also come alongside me as we grow this business, so you can come up and understand that fully too. And it's the combination of those two things, as you say, Cosimo, what he learns, his incredible business sense, and it really is incredible. We can show some examples of this, but also how he entwines that with his artistic taste to go and really bring about the Renaissance, to be called rightfully the Godfather of the Renaissance.
Am I right in thinking that Giovanni extended Cosimo a lot of latitude early in his career to take on real responsibility, real risks, to own things that, if they went badly, could be disastrous for the bank as a whole? Which is something I've been writing about, the importance of, if you are to avoid the common situation in which a wealthy child feels purposeless, you have to give them purpose, and that involves giving them stakes. That involves allowing them really to do damage to your enterprise, but at the same time making it clear to them that they have a task in front of them, that there is an objective, that they can serve the family interests as no one else could.
Absolutely. So this is best seen in a phenomenally interesting period of church history, very confusing as well. But to make a very long story short, the Medici become the bankers of a pope, who will then become Giovanni. Okay, so the father, he gets in with this guy who is at the time Pope John the 23rd. Now, some people might know Pope John the 23rd as being actually a 20th century pope. That's because the Pope John the 23rd that we're talking about is an anti-pope. Okay, so his name is Baldassare, and he will basically become known as an anti-pope. And there's this whole council to figure out what do we do with these people? What are we trying to do here? And what happens could have brought the Medici very well to the brink of disaster. What Giovanni does is he sends his son to Rome. So, of course, the Medici are based out of Florence, but they have a Roman branch, which accounts for over half of their revenues. And most of that, of course, is coming from their role as bankers to the Pope. So he sends Cosimo down to Rome to figure out, what are we doing in this situation, and to kind of get a lay of the land. Now, when the Council of Constance breaks out and they say, hey, we have to figure out, what we're doing with these anti-popes. All right, Cosimo accompanies the then Pope John the 23rd to the council, where he is at that point deposed. Now, what happens next is phenomenally entertaining, and I just found this one of the best episodes in all of this, all of the Medici history. What happens is Baldassare, this anti-Pope John the 23rd, he's imprisoned, and he's able to get out. He's able to put up essentially the bail. The bail, however, that he asked, the loan that he asked for the Medici, is equivalent to over half of their revenues of the past 20 years combined. So over half of what they've made for the past 20 years, that is what he's asking. He has no chance of ever paying this loan back. Everyone knows this, okay? But the Medici are held in a really tough position, because to be a banker in this day, it's not like the banks of today. To be a banker in this day means you have to be loyal and you have to be liquid. You have to know that if someone comes to you asking, you're going to be there for them. So they're in a very tough position of either they say no, and they're now the people who won't pay if they don't think that you have good reason to pay them back, which is, that's the crime ultimate in this age that they're living in. Or they do give the loan, but then they're out, of their revenues. Now, what is interesting is it comes down, I won't say it comes down to Cosimo to make the decision. It's going to be his father's decision. But Cosimo absolutely spurs him on to making the decision that they make, which Cosimo says, I know that our bank could be ruined if we make this. We're not going to get the money back. Everyone knows that. We know that. Baldassare, the anti-pope, he knows that. And everyone else in Europe knows that. But let's use that to our advantage and let's spin it, okay? This is not going to be something that we do because we're going to lose the money. We're going to do it. We're going to give him the money to prove that we are so liquid that we can afford to lose it all. And so they take this story, and that's basically how they run with it in the PR, is look at the Medici. They just gave this guy who has absolutely no prospects a ridiculous sum of money that would ruin almost every other banking family in Europe, but not the Medici. They're liquid. And so what could have been this catastrophic disaster, talk about skin in the game. Cosimo has that immense responsibility of he is the on-the-ground guy tasked with sending this info back to his father. And he has that real responsibility and also the foresight to say, hey, this is going to be the move that we make it. And what could have been utter chaos and catastrophe ends up being the thing that turns the eyes of everyone else in Europe onto the Medici to say, holy smokes, they must be liquid. We want to bank with them. And then, of course, leads to phenomenal success.
One of the lessons from this period that I think is applicable for our time increasingly is in the lack of any kind of stable institutions, an economy of personal trust and integrity and reputation arises. So, what you see in this period, and one of the things that allowed the Medici to rise to prominence in the first place, is that banks are constantly collapsing, losing money. This is interrupted by the plague, foreign trade, the fall of popes, and so forth. One of the things the Medicis do well is play this game of trust in a very intelligent manner. The bank is staffed by relatives, and relatives are preferred whenever possible. Cosimo takes over the Rome branch, which is obviously a central branch, when he's still very young. One of the things that's demonstrated in the episode you're discussing is that even if a loyal client was to fall and all their prospects were removed, the Medici will stand by them. The Medici will bail them out. Now, that is very attractive as a mechanism to attract future popes, because the popes themselves and cardinals and so forth, all kinds of economic intrigue continue. And this is pre-Vatican Bank. So the popes have their own personal bankers. And this is really one of the things that allows the Medici to launch themselves into European prominence, is them being the bankers of trust to a string of popes. So they really understand this question of integrity, trust, personal loyalty, and reputation that arises from that.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it as well is when you study their history kind of over the span of generations, you see how they themselves are aware of what they're doing and conscious that they are repeating the same playbook. Okay, so this is not the only occasion to say that they will do something that's extravagant in which they actually can't afford, but that they understand the optics of it and they understand that it'll build the trust to more than recoup their investment of it. And so, it happens multiple occasions with the people they host and welcome in Florence, like this sort of thing. They understand very much the optics of it. But I even hate to use that word optics because while, yes, on some ways, they can't actually afford what they're doing, by virtue of doing it, they are able to afford it. And they do stick by the people, and so it is this loyalty that becomes absolutely important. But for anyone else who's a student, I should say, of even more recent history, knows that family isn't by default the better move for trust. There's none other to look to than Napoleon for this. I mean, he put his family in positions of power all across Europe. A family you could say that comes from even somewhat of a similar Italian, quote unquote, background because they're Corsican, which is closer to Italian than it is French. And so you would think that, this family that he makes kings and nobility all throughout Europe, that they're going to back him. In reality, they betray him one after the other repeatedly, repeatedly. And so this point of putting family in these positions isn't necessarily the saving grace. What you have to do is, as you said, put them in positions of responsibility and to cultivate this family culture that they understand this is who we are and this is what we do. That almost more than anything, I think, is key to this. It's not simply, again, giving them the money. It's not giving them the responsibility. It's endowing them with this sense of this is who we are and this is what we do. To go to the Godfather, you don't go against the family, like this sort of thing. And to have them understand this, that is what allows them to then trust that they can put their family in positions of power and that they will be trustworthy when they do.
One of the things that's interesting about the Medici from the standpoint of the arguments we're making is that they are a banking family. I'm not sure, I'm no expert on banking. I'm not sure if they actively engage in usury. I'm sure they have some exposure there. But this is very far from a pure endeavor. And I think probably they're involved in some morally contemptible intrigues at various points. And yet, even in the context of that somewhat, at least from a faith standpoint, lowly profession, they're able to build something of stability and beauty. And again, I don't want to idealize them or heroize them, but I do think that their fruits in certain domains are self-evident. So I think maybe this is a calling for people. I see a lot of people in our sphere biasing towards selling their family business and giving their children liquid capital as an inheritance because they feel that it's not some kind of noble or glamorous business. And I think that's a mistake. I think really the emphasis should not be on passing your children as much money as possible or avoiding supposed low status associations. It should be, as you say, on building the integrity of the family itself and elevating the profession and the community around the business.
Yeah, I think this is immensely true. For all the great things that we're saying about the Medici, obviously, there are great Medici from standpoints of faith. There are some really devout people in the family. Also, there's a lot of people who are quite the opposite. And part of the reason Cosimo does, in fact, get so involved in art is somewhat as a way to clean his conscience, because he understands that he is, in fact, engaging in usury. And this is a big part. He actually has a moment, like there's a moment you can pinpoint where he goes and has a conversation with a spiritual father and goes on this retreat to a monastery and kind of afterwards resolves, one of the ways that I have to pay this back is to endow these gifts to the church and to the populace and invest in these things that reflect the truth of the gospel. So all that said, to go back to the point of selling a business and giving capital, I think we're all aware, and you've certainly talked about this. I believe you've mentioned this in one of your articles, the fact that, by the data, that doesn't play out in the long run. That doesn't play out, it doesn't result successfully in the long run. Families who do that are more likely to squander that within, 3 generations than those who don't, who actually pass down a business. What is, though, as you said, important, and I think the horse that we want to beat continually here as it dies and perhaps is long dead, is that you have to pass down the culture of like this is what you are and this is what you're doing. And it's not just the business, it's understand, why are we doing this in the first place? And this is something that I think a business allows more than just inherited wealth, because a business is it I want to I'm actually going to reference, as I do here, I have a prayer before work to St. Joseph composed by Pope St. Pius X. And he says something in here. He says, considering it an honor to employ and develop by means of labor the gifts received from God. And I think there is something so key in that inherited wealth does not allow you to employ and develop by means of labor the gifts received from God. In money, money is power, and with great power comes great responsibility. You are called to steward wealth well, but part of the way that you actually build the muscle to be able to steward it is by going to work every day and in developing the traits and the virtues that allow you to steward it well, to employ and develop by means of labor the gifts received from God. And so I think this is one of the main reasons that's kind of, the archetype underlying it, is that the fact that businesses are beholden to real world phenomena, the fact that they do have to respond to real markets, that they do come up with things that seem, insurmountable. They cause you to develop the virtues that then allow you to steward that wealth well. And to kind of take this back to everything that the Medici are doing, we think nowadays that if you throw tons of money at a production, it's going to be a great production. But nowhere is this more evident, for example, than Amazon and the Rings of Power. I mean, the most expensive TV show made in its day, and millions upon millions of dollars thrown at this thing, and it's utter crap at the end. But the reason for it is because the writers they did not have the virtue. Like, they physically could not conceive of what makes a good story, what makes good heroism, what actually are the things that Tolkien understood. Because Tolkien, in his work, he's writing about this, but he's also a working man. He's teaching classes, he's learning these things, he's cultivating things. He's a family man. As C.S. Lewis famously said, no man is more married than Tolkien. He's the most married man I know. And so he's living these out and developing them. And that is what allows him to make a story that is eternal, because it speaks to what is eternal values, eternal virtues, these sorts of things. And to just throw money at a scenario and a situation and to think that you're going to get the same result is a fundamentally modern misconception. And with the Medici, what you have is, again, this perfect combination of the wealth, but also for the majority of them, the virtue required to understand what to actually do with that. They have the wealth, but they're also cultivating, really flexing the artistic and creative muscles to know how to manage that wealth well, how to steward it well.
One place that I've spent a fair amount of time in the last few years for work is the Middle East. And nowhere is what you're saying more evident than there. They had this incredible opportunity to create something of lasting impact in that they had limitless financial resources. And in many of these countries, they essentially had a blank canvas on which to develop a totally unique architectural and aesthetic foundation. They had the money to hire the world's best architects, conceptual artists, and so forth. And because of a lack of artistic vision and cultural sophistication and so forth, of certainly many of the early people involved in those initiatives, what they ended up doing was cloning late Western business architecture and putting that in a desert, which is just unspeakable aesthetic atrocity. On the other hand, one can imagine a counter scenario where, due to a deep reverence for their own artistic and aesthetic traditions, which are rich in the Middle East, they could have come up with an entirely new set of architectural principles and built something that was akin to a modern wonder of the world. I mean, with the financial resources they throw at it, you can only imagine what they could have built. But instead, it's downtown Frankfurt in the desert. It really is a soul destroying place.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It is, in many ways, the definition of new money. I think this is, there's so much to this though, and what you see, to look at a counterexample to that, just to go back to great families from history, and what they see is that sometimes what looks pedantic to us, what looks unreasonable, are precisely the things that help preserve a legacy over time and to create what's beautiful. I need to write about this more. I don't often, because I'm kind of focused on other parts and speaking directly from figures from history. But one thing when I think of the US, as someone who is, of course, American, but has resided for the better part of the past decade outside of the country, one thing that I think of a lot with the US is that it's primordial sin, let's say that, like its fundamental sin is that it's iconoclast. I see it so much, even in quote unquote, legacy families. There's still this tendency to not like something specifically because there's a history behind it. I mean, from the most, from actually like, building family legacies to attitudes of how to even run a business. Like this whole idea that nepotism is bad is a fundamentally American idiotic take. I have to say that. Like it's a fundamentally American thing. You know what? Why would we do that? I mean, no, we're too advanced. We're too modern. Like this is something that backwards people did back then. You see it even in like baby names, traditional names. I mean, people laugh at you if you say, "Oh, I'm going to name my kid like John or Philip or Mark." Oh, why don't you want to do something unique? It's like they express their personality through how they name their child. And it's so, I hate to say they, because I'm not trying to, I am American as well. And so I know that, part of this has infected my thinking. But I think this iconoclasm and dramatic individualism makes it hard to see the inherent value in taking a longer time to do things and actually understanding like this is how we're going to run our institutions. This is how we're going to do stuff. I don't want to say the specifics of this, but basically there is an order that has branches worldwide. And I know this because I'm currently going through the process. And basically in the US, to become a part of it, the waiting period is 1 year, or like the trial period, is a year. And to many Americans, that's already like crazy. That's super long, a year. In Italy, though, it's 3. It's 3. So it's 3 times the length. And to me, I roll my eyes when I hear that the first time, and it pains me. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, why can't I just do this in the States where it's easier? But I have to understand that part of the reason this institution has developed how it is precisely because of this. And so I think, what I have found, I can't tell people what to do, but what I have found in my own life and my own business is to really hit pause every time I'm tempted to scoff at, the way that things are done, to put it that way, and to ask, why are they done? And could my 21st century American mindset be the one that's incorrect here and not the one that's cutting edge? We love to be cutting edge. We love to, advance. Even amongst conservatives, I think there's this myth of progress. Oh, we're always developing better ways to do things. It's like, no, maybe that's not true at all. And at least if you hit pause and simply ask the question, growing up doing business myself, there are things that I would look at other people in my community, the way that they were doing it, and they were very, let's say, protective of certain things. They wouldn't allow you to do business a certain way because they're like, no, that's not how we do things. I was like, come on, like you got to get with the times. You got to do it this way. I see now the wisdom in what they were doing, because why would they, looking back on it, like now I wouldn't trust myself if my same 20-year-old self came and spoke to me and said, hey, let's do this. Because I'd say, what skin in the game do you have? Have you done it yourself? Have you put your money on the line? Like, come back to me when you're prepared to make that investment with your own stuff. Skin in the game, like it's the only thing that matters to understand. Like, as you raise a family, as you keep a family business, like how do you grow up with those things, that skin in the game, to where respect is earned.
So it's either Hell's Angels, Freemasons, or the Knights Templar that you're joining. We'll see. Only one of those gets you banned from this podcast from then on. But
Exactly.
good luck with your application process.
Yes, thank you.
One thing that requires a deeper dive is the concept, philosophically speaking, of nepotism, because historically nepotism meant something specific, and I think it was a negative, and we've lost sight of that. Nepotism, there's actually an interesting Italian connection here. So nepotism is etymologically related to the Italian for nephew. And the history here, this is just off the top of my head, so rough sketch, but the history here is that there was a period when popes would have illegitimate sons, and senior prelates of the church would have illegitimate sons who they would then seek to elevate because they were their children, even if illegitimate, and they would describe them as their nephews, and they would give them prestigious positions within the church. This is clearly a negative, and it's a negative because it's a usurpation of an institution that is not yours to singularly define the purpose of, in order to elevate those improperly who you happen to be related to. So this is similar to cronyism in the context of democracies, republican political configurations, in which you have a legitimate state institution, and just because a particular party has managed to grab temporary power of that state institution, they use that to enrich themselves and their wider clan by improperly and uncompetitively awarding state contracts and positions to their friends. Now, there's a subtlety there, which is these institutions are not yours to use for your own ends. These are higher institutions in which you and your service to those institutions are supposed to be doing a duty to a broader body of people and indeed to God. The problem is America, in its Enlightenment Constitution and its commitment to democracy, has personalized that commitment, in that any kind of institutional favor for one's own becomes suspect, even when there isn't this distinction of it is not an institution that you rightfully control. So in the context of a family business, the rightful dependents and recipients of the fruits of that business are in fact your own family. So it's not an instance of nepotism to reward them using the fruits of that institution. In fact, it's quite proper. That is what the institution should be constructed for, as you say. So I think there's a lot of sort of intellectual, philosophical, and historical untangling here that is worth engaging in.
Yeah, I think that's right. Cronyism is obviously a good thing to avoid, but it all comes down to, as you said, how are the institutions being used? And more importantly, to beat the dead horse that we've beat previously, it comes down to how are you raising your children? What is the culture that you are teaching them? What is normal for them and what is their purpose? If they are oriented with an understanding of service, then they can go out and use these institutions in a way to serve the people. And in fact, the best instances of nepotism, and we can call these the best, kings and monarchs who have ever reigned, they do this precisely because they understand their role as one of service. Their role is one of service to their people. It is not for themselves. This is something, again, that I try to write about like every time we cover a monarch, because it's so just ingrained in the American consciousness that, and really, I mean, all the Western world at this point, that kings were bad, they're in it for themselves, this sort of thing. But no, they were driven predominantly by a sense of duty and service to their people. And so we have to understand that. But to come back to the business side of things, this is why a business, even like solopreneurship, small scale entrepreneurship, family business on very small degrees, it's nice because you don't have to worry about that same pressure. You can kind of be more overt with the fact of saying like, yeah, I'm running this for my family. That's the reason I started it. And in doing so, the fact that it is a business, you have to provide value to others. You have to, quote unquote, serve them in that way. So you are serving your family because you're running the business, but you're also, in order to serve them, you have to do a good job, serving others. And I think what people dislike, and rightfully so, is when you get into an institution that is designed, let's say a governmental organization that is designed to serve the people, but then it's just fleeced for the enrichment of the person who's at the head of it. And that's obviously bad. But I think that with a lot of this stuff, we do need to recover a healthy understanding of nepotism. Last thought to go with that is simply that nipote in Italian is not only the word for nephew, but it's also the word for grandchild. There's something in that. It sounds kind of strange, like why do they use the same word for both? But there's something in that it's an understanding of your responsibility to that person. So an uncle's responsibility to his nephew is akin to a grandparent's responsibility to their grandchild. And I find that interesting because it kind of redefines those sorts of relationships in a way that we're not used to thinking about it in English.
One of the provocative claims that Aquinas makes in De Regno, the letter to the King of Cyprus on the philosophy and theology of kingship, is that there are greater temporal rewards for kings, and there are even greater spiritual rewards for kings, but there are equally greater risks and punishments for their souls, precisely because in each one of their actions, their decisions, their virtues, and their sins, they have so much impact on the lives of the people around them. And so they are in a unique position of stewardship. One of the other things, and maybe this is my final question, although if there was anything else that you wanted to cover, please call it out. Aquinas talks about the virtue of magnificence, which is the idea that wealthy men should stretch forth their minds to great things and use their position to build great things, to physically shape the world around them, to reflect the glory of God. One of the things that I think the Medici and other European families have done to great effect is in externalizing their values, in commissioning works of art and architecture and so forth. They have allowed for the multi-generational resurrection of their family identity. So even if for a time they have a bad son, even if for a time they are exiled from a city, when they return, when the future generations show up, even if they've had bad fathers themselves, the values and commitments of their forefathers stand before them. And it's the sort of inspiration to return to their level, even if they hadn't had that level of personal guidance.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal point. And this goes back to what we said in the beginning of the Medici building literally, literal buildings, erecting them all around Florence and beautifying the city in which they lived. Because it was not only a point of remembrance for the populace, for when the Medici would be exiled to say, hey, remember who built all these great things and now things aren't as pretty. It wasn't just for that, but it was for the Medici themselves. It was for them to say, look at what we aspire to and what we really are deep down. And part of the wisdom that I see in great families, families who really stand the test of time, leave wonderful legacies, is that they accept this as an inevitability, that there are going to be bad eggs. There are going to be bad eggs in positions of power also. So again, how do you build a system that can endure that? If you only construct a system where you say, I'm going to raise my kids well, and there's never going to be any issues, for as important as that is, you have to rather build something where you can say, how can I raise my kids the best I can, but understand that at some point, at some point in the line, there's going to be a bad egg. And how can what we construct resist that, be resilient in light of that? I'll give one kind of contemporary example and then go back to the Medici, but even Berlusconi, when he passed, and he passed down his main business to his children, he made it so that they cannot sell it unless it's a unanimous vote. So, what one small thing is a silly example, but just one small thing of like, no, it's not that, greatest thing goes. It's that if this business is ever sold outside the family, it has to be a unanimous vote amongst all the stakeholders being, the members of the family. That's one thing he did. To go back to, I said I was going to go back to the Medici, but I actually meant the Habsburgs. This is something that Edward Habsburg writes about in his first book, The Habsburg Way, and he talks about, some of the quote unquote bad eggs in the Habsburg family. So Rudolph over in Prague, all the kind of magic and stuff he got into and died really, he didn't even have a confessor at his deathbed. He didn't care about that, which at the time was, absolutely a statement. But while that was happening, there's a couple generations around them as well where, let's say, the overt piety of the Habsburg seems to take a back seat. Well, at that same time, there are siblings and there are cousins, but who are actually right. It's so cool because we have the correspondence of like what they're writing to each other and how they are keeping the flame alive in those moments. And so to have this thing I guess it has to do with making a culture that's so strong that when there are deviations from it, others are able to look at that and not say, oh, this is just a progression, but they are in fact able to say, no, that is a deviation. And they're able to see it as such. And they're able to call themselves back to the ideal once that has come to pass.
Evan, this has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. Where can people find you?
They can find me at Substack. So I write both the Invictus and the Culturist Substack. For your audience, will probably be more interested in the Invictus one because it's just practical lessons from great men of history week in and week out. And then also at Twitter or on X at Sir Evan Amato over there. They can follow me. So thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure.
Okay, everyone. See you next time. If you enjoyed this discussion, please go to becomingnoble.substack.com or click the link in the description, where you can find my best work, including over 100 essays, interviews with popular guests, and our chat, where you can talk with other excellent and like-minded people. That's becomingnoble.substack.com.